welcome back to Connecting Conversations with Cohesia Connect. I literally can't speak today. It's been a day already. um, I hope you all have had a great time and had a chance to listen to my solo podcast that I did last week. We're going to try and incorporate more and more of these collaborative podcasts with one another, but also solo podcasts, because I think it provides a space of reflection, of thought, that allows us to engage with you in a little bit of a one-to-one personal level, in hopes that it will, you can reflect as well in line with us. So do listen to that if you haven't already. But today on this podcast, you will see my lovely co-host is and raring to go.
Is that what we're calling it? Okay.
My partner in crime.
Oh dear heaven.
We don't commit crimes here, really. But we're back here together to have another bit of a reflective session with you all, and Carla has a lot of insight to bring us in this week podcast to enlighten us about her trip back to South Africa. And I think it's always a great time, as I said earlier, to decompress, to take reflective pauses in allowing us to move forward with certain discussions. And I'm sure Carla would open up a lot about what that experience has been for her, and the deep complicated issues that also arise, especially when we're talking about the wider diversity and inclusion landscapes.
So for those that probably don't know, I was born in Cape Town, South Africa, but I've been living here in the UK for, gosh, we're pushing 30 years now. So this has really been my home. This is what I know. And it's interesting because I think not too long ago we'd had a podcast sharing about your experiences going back home to your place of birth as well in Anguilla, and what an experience that was. And similarly, different contexts, different stories that we both have. There's definitely something about returning to the place of origin and returning to a place of forefathers, or the places where we kind of root so much of our personal culture and sense of ethnicity, and what it's like to go back into that environment after a very long period of time. So for me, I've not visited South Africa for about, I'd say almost 10 years, pushing 10 years, which is a long time. And even though I had been back and forth through youth and even as an adult, this occasion felt quite different personally. And I'm really glad that you raised in your introduction about when we consider understanding what's it like to go into different cultural environments when we are occupying and we are practicing on the D&I landscape here in the UK. And it's really good to take stock, I think. And for me, I think one of the things that I experienced, and first and foremost that kind of hit me when I was there, was an appreciation, actually. Yes, we feel really passionate about being in the diversity, equity and inclusion space here, because we recognize the need for fairness. We recognize the need for empowerment. We want to stand up for the marginalized, and just making sure this is a fair, positive world that really is benefiting from an inclusivity and diversity of richness from the people that are represented here in the UK. And as much as we recognize a lot of the challenges, because that's what we're trying to mitigate, aren't we? This is what our work is about.
Yeah.
Having the opportunity to take a step back away and see a very different environment just gave me such a level of appreciation for basic things that maybe even in our kind of quest, should I say, about making things better and bringing change and positivity to this landscape here, about how fortunate we are on baseline elements of understanding and comprehension of the world. And I think for me, I'm not sure if everybody knows, but South Africa has a very, very, very large history with apartheid under the rule whereby those that actually were the indigenous, the original people of the land, were not even recognized as citizens in their own country. And those who belonged to the mixed race community, also known, I say in brackets, coloured people, were seen as second-class citizens. Yeah. Those were the kind of the mixes between both white and African people of that land and that nation, and then you had the white European communities, and they were all segregated. And the idea of class system, that we have similar words class
Mm.
here, but they mean very different things. In South Africa, the idea of
Yeah.
class was actually determined by effectively the gradient of skin tone, really. And that's how people saw their identities. This is how people experienced life. And due to my skin tone, it might be obvious, but so my family would predominantly come from a coloured community. But in saying that, it's complex because my mother's side has a lot of Irish and English relatives,
Mm.
and those are the forefathers that I am told about all the time. My grandfather was born in England, my great grandfather was born in England, and they came to South Africa and made it their home, and that's our connection here. And my mother looks very much like her British kind of family. She's really fair skin, but actually, because my grandmother's side, even though they have a lot of Irish in them, they also had
Mm.
family members that had settled down and married people who came from the communities, coloured and African there. And so, if you were to look at our family, it is the saying that we do look a little bit like the rainbow, but really you don't really know what skin tone your child might have, because genetics are a wonderful thing. And where my
Yeah.
mother looks starkly very European, and I have kind of inherited my father's looks, which is quite tanned. But my sister, who same parents, looks so much like my mum that people always assume that we're friends rather than actually blood related sisters. And this is a common factor within families
Mm.
in South Africa. And the reason I just give this backdrop is just to give you an understanding of, we talk about identity here to do with potentially socioeconomic status, or identity to do with how I
Mm.
feel as a person, how I'm turning up authentically in my individual person. In South Africa, a lot of identity was actually ingrained and entrenched in the color of people's skin, where they were allowed to even take up
Mm.
opportunities of progress, education,
Mm.
and places that they were even allowed to live, was all determined by the skin tone that they had. And this kind of thing, you
Mm.
can imagine, is complex because, like I just shared, when you've got families that have all got different skin tones, you can imagine to the public face how difficult that was to recognize sometimes. This is actually my mom, this is my cousin.
Yeah.
Now, in some cases, it actually separated families from being able to live together. That really actually
Mm.
was the situation. I understand from the stories that I've been told from my mother that
Mm.
my grandfather wasn't actually allowed to live with his father in the same area anymore because he married my grandmother, who is visibly olive skin, so therefore would have belonged to the coloured community, and that would not have been something that was allowed for them. But
Mm.
he loved my nan, and that's what he
Mm.
chose. But it showed you how it separated families. It was a
Mm.
terrible system. And I think the craziness of it is that actually, when Nelson Mandela, who was the person that had come to really shift South Africa and has brought a lot of healing with his leadership, when he came
Mhm.
into the presidency of the nation, and he was the first to kind of bring forward a place where, we could unite people. People are probably familiar with the Invictus Games. That was something that actually
Mm.
he was like, I will represent that. I'm here to unify our players, because rugby is a big deal. It still is a big deal. Now the South African team have got quite a lot of fame all around the world. It's quite a thing.
Yeah.
And what he
Didn't they win
started,
the Rugby World Cup
they had just
recently?
recently won it, which is funny because I was there during
Yeah.
the time of winning of the World Cup. And it's interesting because
Ah.
Nelson Mandela was the first to start the unification of its people through rugby, and wanted to be someone that was seen to support that unification of what the games could do to a nation. And that is
Mm.
still something that rugby is doing for the people now. But what we forget is
Mm.
that Nelson Mandela is still my lifetime. I was there the day that he was actually released from prison after being there for
Wow.
political, one person's political resistance was seen as terrorism. So this was kind of the narrative that he had to kind of navigate during his time. And when he was released from
Mm.
prison, because of what he stood for the equality of people, he was elected into the presidency. That was my lifetime. We,
Mm.
as a family, had actually tried to go to the gates where he was going to be released, but we couldn't get through that day, because you can imagine the masses of crowds wanting to be there for that
Yes.
moment. It is a mark of history. All that to say is that that is still my lifetime. And we look at change, and we look at how we still see such a need of improvement here in the UK. We talk about Windrush, and there is still profiling that we're experiencing. There are still unconscious biases, which we speak about
Mm.
often not being unilateral in any way. It's actually a lot more comprehensive than that, and complex than that. But what we need to understand is that those are decades away. Those are decades back then. but we've been living in a space where people have not been legally allowed to be racist to each other. That is literally the narrative of what South
Mm,
Africa had. And this has only been removed or
mm,
changed in the last 40 years or so, 40 plus years, just over 40 years,
mhm,
round about that time.
mhm,
And all that to say is, going back to South Africa, I think because I've been living here and my life is here, my life is entrenched
mhm.
here, and I have such a privilege of having diverse friendship groups from all ethnic backgrounds, which is something
Mhm.
that we actually, I think, is a
Yeah.
treasure here in the UK. It's something that we can see that, if many ways, I've always thought that the UK is a place where it's a bit of a gateway to all of the world, because many nations are
Mhm.
represented here, and
Yeah.
quite comfortably, yes, there is understanding of difference, but not in the extreme
Mhm.
sense where what I've described South Africa's, background and social background was kind of engaging with, is quite stark to what we see here, even in levels of what we deem as
Mm.
it's not equal. When you have a
Yeah.
legal system that is in place to stop people from allowing them to get into certain areas to live, they can't access education in certain areas, they can't have access to certain jobs, and that's legally okay, is a very different,
Mhm.
I think, extremity and severity of when we talk about
Mm.
inequality. And as much as the
Yeah.
legality element is now overthrown, we are still dealing with the
Mhm.
fact that we have generations who were present at that time. That was the environment they were raised in. So mindsets are still requiring this new stage of transition. And I don't know how long that will be. There is copious discussion everywhere. We don't need to look far about, not too far over the other side of the Atlantic, the USA, slavery has also been abolished for hundreds of years. And also the legal
Mm.
racism that was kind of instilled in segregation there has also been over for decades, like
Yeah.
already in the 60s. But this is what's
Mm.
happening now. This was in the 90s when this happened
Mhm.
for South Africa.
Yeah.
And we can see, like, even now, the USA is still trying to navigate a lot of pain and a lot of trying to find their way out into better spaces in their treatment
Mhm.
of diversity and equality, and that sense of kind of just inclusion amongst its own people.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think I didn't expect on my return. It's not I didn't expect. I think I just hadn't. I'd forgotten that this was still a reality. That this is
Yeah.
not that far away. That people are still very fresh in still trying to figure out our way in a world where this is not how
Mhm.
we should be determining one's value, determining one's
Yeah.
identity, and determining what one should be aspiring to do based on that identity, based in color, based in skin tone. And
Mm.
I think that
Yeah.
was, for me, it hit me a bit like a wall, if I'm honest with you. And
Mm.
also just a feeling of almost like undercurrent and tension. Personally, I can't say this is really what's happening. It's just how I felt that I was being
Mhm.
experienced. I know
Mhm.
that when I was there, when people would hear me open my mouth, they see my skin tone, and they're like, well, she looks like she could be from here. But the minute I open my mouth and my accent, it just was very confusing. And then to top it all off, the idea of interracial relationships was also a huge thing during this time of apartheid. That was not allowed. That was,
We will come to that. We'll save that for a question.
but I think just to add more context in terms of to how much of, like, this was a stark, oh goodness, like I hit a wall element kind of feeling, is
Mm.
because there is that element of what I described about skin tone and class, and they're still trying to figure out
Mhm.
what our mindset should be about people's identities and their value. The idea of, interracial relationships was also something that was also like a huge contentious element in that period of time as
Mm.
well. And I've not seen, on my arrival, unless we were in very touristy places, I didn't really see that many mixed couples either. And again,
Yeah.
as someone who is visiting this space, and this time I've returned to South Africa with my husband, who happens to be of Nigerian descent and has very dark skin tone. And I also know
Mm.
that when people would hear me, that was confusing because of my accent, but my appearance. But then to see us together, and also to see someone who looks like him, he also happens to be
Mm.
very tall, so he doesn't look like many people there.
He just stands out.
He's rather a tall guy at 6'6", so you won't miss him in a crowd. And obviously, our contrast in skin tone was already something as a visual to see.
Mm.
And then also when he opens his mouth, and I think he sounds posher than I am, if I'm very honest with you, perfect Queen's English. that is also confusing. That's not what they would associate normally with someone that has that appearance. And
Yeah. So
yeah, go for it. Sorry. That's just a background. It's like you asked me what it was like going there.
yeah,
There was just
yeah.
this,
So
oh, I forgot this was here kind of element.
yeah, yeah. No, definitely. And I think as you was talking, we were kind of unraveling and unpeeling some of the different emotions that you were feeling at the time, but also revelations that perhaps you weren't made conscious of or you were aware of when you
Mm,
went there with a completely different mindset. I think as we start, specifically with Cohesia Connect, I think we become a little bit more awakened as to what is happening around us. And in the UK, as much as it is seen on an international level, when we then go to places such as South Africa or African continents, or even when I went back home, the the experience in reality is very different.
mhm,
Um, and it's a lot to grapple with. And I had similar feelings going back home as well after being away from the country for, about, I think it was 11 years, and then being faced with a whole reality that my childhood self never really had the intelligence, I would say, or even the awareness as to what was happening. So I think, just to kind of go back to some certain a couple of points that I think is relevant to bring up in the conversation, is this idea of identity. We bang on a lot about it within the inclusion space, and it's such a hot topic as to who gets to frame the identity. Is it the person? Is it a nation state? Is it, do we claim identity based on protected characteristics, like, it is amalgamated in a whole pot that we just seem to have no way out of. But what for you, in going back and having that experience in South Africa, what does identity mean to you now that you've had that experience? Is it as important, or do you think it's become a little bit reductive and you've kind of had a new framing or outlook as to what identity is or could be?
I think for me personally, I think that's such a great question. And that was actually what I think was challenged the most. Like, who am I? I've been navigating this space with diversity and inclusion for a long time, even whilst before we'd forged Cohesia Connect as a company, what we're doing. But this is the space I've been occupying even when I was within education and teaching. This was a big part of kind of a focus that I tried to bring into my classrooms with young people. And I think for one thing, it gave me on one level an understanding of like, even as we've become practitioners of this space, wanting to specialize in helping and aiding cohesion amongst differences in people in the workplace, in professional spaces, and reflective in our education, it's coming with the understanding that because we are a diverse nation, we also need to realize that people have very diverse ideas of what identity is. And those
Yeah.
protected characteristics, if anything, are, I would say they're a starting point, but we certainly cannot be fooled into thinking this is how we need to base an entirety of the discussion of what
Mm,
identity should be put in. And I think coming away and just being exposed to a different culture that apparently I'm familiar with, but also felt like an alien in, really highlighted that
mm,
aspect. So when we're discussing issues of identity and when we're trying to figure out programs and initiatives to support a cohesion between discussion of people from different diverse backgrounds about identity, it's already, we need to have the mindset, or I think for me it was an awakening of an understanding that be mindful that what I say by identity is not something that everybody's speaking as a language. We need to probably become
mm,
more versed and more aware of what the diversities of identities are meaning for different types of people that we are trying
mm-hmm.
to bring together, particularly here in the UK. And this is a place
Yeah.
that I occupy. I'm from the UK, you're from the UK, but yet we occupy dual mindsets and dual cultures.
Mm,
We need to think bigger outside of the box of what identity apparently at this point has been kind of designated to right now
yeah.
amongst the protected characteristics. Second of all,
Yeah.
for me, on a personal level, it was really challenging. And a lot of the time we
Mm,
spend here in our podcast is amplifying the stories of other people. This is a hard story for me. And
Mm.
it feels uncomfortable to be in the hot seat, I think. And I'll be honest in saying that this is not a comfortable discussion, because as much as this is my story, I do wonder if this might be triggering for somebody else who might come from my place of origin, but has had a very different narrative and experience because of this
Mm.
very sensitive, very almost volatile issue of what identity means there. So
Yeah.
all that to say is I want to put in there a sense of, this is not to accuse or put onus on or put responsibility anywhere else. I'm just sharing an experience of what it feels like for me, for someone who was
Mm-hmm.
brought, I didn't, to a new country by my parents. Like you, as a child, I have no concept of the magnitude of what was happening in this nation. I learn more and more about it now. I see the gravity of the different
Yeah.
levels of what that old system that was experienced during apartheid actually meant for people coming as an adult. And again, I'm not living in that time, but going back as someone who's like a semi-tourist, um,
Mm.
feeling so out of place and feeling almost, I don't know, I was almost like there was a demand on me of like,
Mm-hmm.
there's undercurrents of people don't understand what I am. And because the country is wired through apartheid and that very terrible system, for people to look at each other through those lenses of color and take a stand.
Mm.
What's your identity? Your class is determined by your skin color, therefore you must fulfill all of these prerequisites that we have as a stereotype for that. And me not being able to fulfill any of those, I found myself almost in a space of, do I need to apologize for my existence because you can't
Mm.
understand it? And that doesn't mean, and again, nobody asked me outright, what are you? But I felt in the sense of
Mm-hmm.
the confusion that I would experience in some interactions. People are asking me, what are you? Where do you stand? Who do you see yourself as? And it is this offensive that if I was to say, actually, I see myself as British, even though I have these origins here, because my life is here, my thinking is
Mm-hmm.
British, my ways of framing and understanding the world, my education has been solely British. All of those
Mm-hmm.
elements make me what I am now. That is difficult, I imagined, in trying to answer someone who would ask me that question there, to hear that from someone that supposedly should be from, who has origins in
Mm.
the same place that they have. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think just on that point, do you think the nation, so if we look at your example in South Africa, do you think a nation like South Africa has created this particular sense of national identity of who has and who hasn't? Do you think it's the nation that's driving that sentiment and that narrative?
I
Or do you
don't
think
think
it's
that
down to individual collectives of
I think
people?
the original regime of what apartheid was trying to instill that
Mm.
in people as a mind. It was a
Mm-hmm.
divide and conquer, separating people. A lot of it was through fear as well, keeping people separate, saying that this was not, and kind of vilifying one group to another with
Mm.
propaganda, even in their education systems. Um, from the stories that I've heard from my parents during their education, some of their narratives are like, there is a way that they would actually teach a different version of history depending on which school you were in, which means that you were only, if you were someone who belonged to an all black school or a coloured school or an all white school, you would have different versions of the education, three types of everything. And you can imagine who was getting the best resources, who is getting the watered down resources, and who is getting the worst resources. So imagine even the type of education that's taught in terms of,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a terrible example, but from what I've heard from their stories, is similarly when we look at stories of how propaganda presented the Jewish people during the Second World War, is similarly how they would actually write about different racial groups or the different color groups effectively in school education. This was how they
Mm-hmm.
were trying to separate people. Does
Yeah.
that make
And
sense?
did you feel there was that, I guess, fee not feeling, but did you anticipate that when you were going to South
I
Africa?
didn't
Those kind of
anticipate that at all.
underline.
I didn't
Okay.
anticipate that at all. But what the reason why I brought that example in it is just to give some context in terms of,
Mm-hmm.
because this is the mindset that has been kind of indoctrinated into the people from children. And remember,
Mm-hmm.
this regime has not been over for that long. It's only been in my lifetime. Can you imagine those that maybe in their 50s, 60s, 70 years old? This is the only world that they knew. That was the world that, and the environment that was provided for them. You now have an up and coming generation like myself who was there when the change and the shift over into this new era has been there. But that doesn't go away just because you've not made it legal anymore to be racist. Those
Yeah.
mindsets will take
Have
time to
still.
undo.
Yeah.
Those mindsets is this tension between the generations of like
Hmm.
to be more outward focused, but that's difficult to bring that home, and everybody's trying to navigate that way forward. And people
Mm.
are taught what they know within the home. They're taught what they know in
Yeah.
the groups that they would hang out, feel comfortable with. Because again, that was
Mm.
almost, if we were to say it figuratively, it may as well have just been almost yesterday in the big scheme of what it takes in terms of time for things like this to really change.
Yeah.
So I don't think, this was just to answer your previous question, I don't think that the nation is driving that sense of national identity. I don't think so, like that. I think they're trying to find what their identity is after trying to recover from such
Mm.
brokenness and such divisiveness that has been not so long in the history, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think my arrival there was someone that came in the middle of it, like, this is alien to me. It's alien to me to feel that it's in the atmosphere. And like I said, people trying to figure out, what are you? Who are you? This doesn't
Yeah.
make sense to me. And
Mm.
so what do you think you are? Because I imagine in a country or in a place where people are trying to find their identities now
Yeah.
after something that they've been through, I probably am someone who's probably quite different to what they know and how that navigation probably looks
Yeah.
like in that environment.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think it's always such a struggle to be in a space of where do I turn and how do I identify myself. It brings up an emotion, like intense emotions of uncomfortability, because you just don't know. You were driven a certain um kind of narrative for so long, and then now that's been ripped away and you're seeing more and more of this explosion of diversity in your country, and you're just like, but it's never been like this. So I can understand the confusion of how that how that has made some people to feel, and perhaps what you were confronted with, faced with that confusion, which then led to your added to your confusion. I'm just like, well, if you don't know, I don't know. Like,
I think you just, I don't have, what do you respond to that? And I'm never,
yeah,
here in the UK, we're not in an environment where I even have to think that that's something
think
that would
about
even be a
it.
question for me, because our ideas of identity, as we alluded to at the very start of this conversation, is quite different.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
do you know what I mean? It's quite
yeah.
different, and it's just, I think that the depth of how deep this goes, I think, for the people there, from what I saw and experienced, is something that
Hmm.
I feel it would be presumptuous of me to even try to assume what that's like.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's an everyday thing that they have to face amongst each other, trying to,
Mm,
daily life, figuring out what my aspirations are, figuring out where's my place in the workplace, figuring out how we interact with each other, getting rid of, like, can
mm,
we bring down those walls of separation,
mm.
bring down anger about, and this is what apartheid did to them
Yeah,
psychologically. It was a terrible thing.
yeah.
Um,
No, and
and
I
they're
can.
really just trying to find their way into a more healed space, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't think we talk about the recovery of that enough, especially on a global context, because there are nations and countries that are still trying to navigate this space of identity, and who are we as a collective nation, but also who am I as an individual. And those are big questions, and I think the Western world has set a certain standard as to what identity should look like, and how it should be, um and how it should be acted upon, and how it should be performed. But there are nations, like you said, like in South Africa, where that is still such a struggle. And how do we overcome that, and how do we get them to a place of, this is what we are, this is who we are, this is who I am. It's a long process, and I think, in the sake of D&I, we know these things are not overnight fixtures and solutions. These are long, grueling processes of change that is completely uncomfortable, that we just don't navigate enough. But coming back to, and this is probably a big question, and we probably will need some more time to talk about this. But in a brief outline, how you mentioned about your interracial relationship with your husband, who is of Nigerian background and who is dark skinned and stands out due to his height, but also his intellect as well, and coming to a space and having conversations which may, I don't know if this is a correct way to say this, but in the space where South Africans weren't confronted with that in the past, how did you navigate that? Going there, did you feel, and I guess my key question, did you feel uncomfortable or did you feel a sense of protection?
I think a little bit of both, if I'm honest, because
Mm.
I tend to feel he doesn't know this. So if he ever finds this conversation, this will be news to him. I feel very protective over him in general. I think in the UK, I feel protective over him because I think I have navigated a space as a mixed race woman here in the UK, but my story and my narrative of being someone of colour is quite different to many others. I'm very sensitive and aware of that difference. And I'm very much about it's really not one size that fits all. And that would be terrible to try to assume that there is just one way of how people are experiencing life in their own skin. With him as well, I think being married to someone like that, for the first time, I have a front row seat in terms of what I take for granted in my everyday experience. He actually has very different experiences in terms of because he's so tall and he's got quite a lot of stature in that aspect. He has had to work so hard to make sure that he tries to make himself small because he's a big black man. Could you imagine? So even he's got to have conscious effort to mind the way that my tone of voice is speaking, try like he can never get angry, he can never express a deep sense of emotion because of all the associations that come with that in a negative way that could end up penalizing him in ways that are quite frankly unfair because those allowances are given for other racial groups within our nation and it's not carrying the same weight and association at all. So I am protective over him. I felt even more so because visiting a place where I've come from and we shared about just
Mm-hmm.
how different the different kind of colored groups or colored
Mm-hmm.
groups are treated differently. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
that was something that I considered. Will there be an association? Will there be assumptions? But because he's so tall, but then the minute he opens his mouth and he speaks, I could see he became quite a quick novelty. People wanted to chat to him more. They're more inclined to hear because, like, oh, you're not from here, but I'm very intrigued. And he's a really social and warm person. And I'm so thankful that that is tends to be, no matter where he goes in the world, what always supersedes what we talk
Yeah.
about, these terrible stereotypes and profiling elements that happen when we
Mm.
become part of this overarching, it's just a number, a person that belongs to this community or this kind of idea, rather than the person that gets to put themselves forward in their
Yeah.
authentic self. And thankfully his experience, he has so many positive experiences because he's always led with that and he relies on that and he leans into it, and he's always been very conscious about how he navigates that and takes ownership, like,
Yeah.
this is my identity, this is who I am. And that's what he leads
Mm.
with. It automatically disarms everybody else and everything else around him. It's not fair that someone who looks like him has to go through that extra kind of preparations or extra mindful, conscious, like, put my armor on in this type of way today, which other people don't
Mm-hmm.
have the liberty not to even think about and go about their business and they will be okay. But in the same breath, he sees it as almost like it's a superpower because he shatters expectations wherever he goes and stereotypes wherever
Mm.
he goes. And there was no exception in our
And I
experience.
can testify to that.
And you know, and that is
Just saying.
and I think this was where, going back to the question that we were speaking about earlier in terms of identity, these were discussions we were having together. And he was like, I know that you feel this way coming
Mm.
here. I know this kind of stuff makes you quite anxious and you're trying to prepare. And I'm going ahead and also making assumptions of what to expect in terms of, do I need to be on guard or protective over this? He's like, these are actually not our problems personally. Me
Mm.
going on holiday to visit family and to introduce him, that was the purpose of that trip, to introduce him to
Mm.
family members that didn't have the chance because we got married in COVID, and we've got this very
Mm.
like random story about how we got together, and they were never privy to that. They were never part of that. And this was a privilege to be able to go there and to do that. And I also knew what this will
Mm.
take for those that belong to the communities that my family are from in South Africa,
Mm,
knowing the hardships of what divisiveness does between different people of different, I
mm,
don't like to say races, but different ethnic groups or different skin tones. And
mm,
I believe like even us coming together and us going there was a huge privilege, because this is a start of something new, and healing can come. They
mm,
can demythify what they've been taught from age old
yeah,
systems and see like love can dwell here, that peace
yeah.
can abide together in our difference. And he was incredible. My aunts just wanted to feed him order, which is a very South African trait. Hospitality is key as a cultural.
Because that was going to be my follow-up
Mhm.
question, like, because of the systemic attitudes that long, plagued the city,
Mm,
did your family were you met with resistance from your family? Like, I think that the audience will be really keen to know, because he's now not crossing, but he's now being introduced to a family that has lived through the worst of the worst
for
during the
sure.
apartheid.
In these elements, yeah, that's a great
Mm,
question. I think it was a shock to some of them when we got engaged. And like I said, like
mm,
they never really saw us dating. But I think that it was they didn't quite know what to do. And again, I
okay.
had no expectation, that I didn't think that was evil of them. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
have the knowledge of understanding psychologically the way in which this group of people sadly have been set up through life and the
Mm-hmm.
circumstances that were way out of their control. There is a point where we do have to take action, like I can make a choice now, but I
Mm-hmm.
am also aware of context, and that was something that we've both been quite sensitive. So grateful. My husband is also like, I don't hold anybody to a standard of expectation, knowing the backdrop and the social background that they've been subjected to. Really, I think that's the word. Nobody
Mm-hmm.
chose that
Yeah.
in terms of that aspect,
Yeah.
certainly from their
Mm,
communities and their circles, etc. And I
yeah.
knew that that was, but the moment that he arrived, he was so embraced. But again, he's such
Oh.
a social person and was just like, hello,
He
family.
really is.
And he's got the best hugs ever. And all my aunts are really tiny. I'm generally quite tall for a woman in UK terms at least. And even there, and they're all probably no more than about 5'1", and I'm 5'7", 5'8", and he's 6'6". So all he found us being enveloped in these massive bear hugs, and just were like, oh, when they like melt into, I'm like, okay, lady,
Yeah.
let's back off here a little bit. And they just
Please
love,
back it up.
and he's so good at like sitting and talking and listening to their stories, and has patience with it. They felt honored, but I could see that for them, that's what honors them. That's their idea of a good time:
Mm,
is you sit at my table, you eat my food, you appreciate my food, and show me your
mm,
appreciation by enjoying it, and you just
mm,
take your time to take interest in me. And he is, I think, is an absolute pro at that when it comes to aunties and that type of generation, if I'm
mm.
honest. And he absolutely, he charmed them, and not because he was trying to charm them. He doesn't do flash like that, but his genuine interest under
Mm.
his warmth, I think it won them over, and they were like, please come back, my boy. When they say that word, then
Oh,
we
yeah.
can't wait to see you again,
Yeah.
my boy. And he just it took graciousness from both sides, and I was so pleased to see it. I think, like I said, this is what enhanced that feeling of, this is a privilege that I get to go and do this. It is a moment of
Yes.
coming together, things that would have never happened historically. Always a
Mm,
hard thing
mm,
historically for people to try and navigate, because of the way in which a system had set up its
mhm.
people in a really sad way.
Yeah. So, just to kind of close off the podcast, I would give you some time to think about this. But based on your trip back, based on what we've explored and discussed, and your feelings and the reflection you took as a result of this trip, could you think of one word that sums up that whole experience?
Wow, that is the hardest question in the whole wide world I've ever been asked.
You're welcome.
In terms of the experience itself,
Mm-hmm.
I think I would say, in a nutshell, there were so many words there. But I think, can I have two words rather than one word? No, I'm just trying to think.
Okay, I'll let you be a rebel. Okay, two words.
No, let's go with what you said with your first word. I would say it could be two, and I dangle between these two, but
Okay.
it'll be on one
Yeah.
of them.
Okay. Let's hear it.
So it's either enlightening and healing for both
Mm,
for two very different reasons. I would say if I was going to sit in the camp of enlightening, it's just like
mm,
the awareness of a different comprehension of what has happened in the history of the nation, and
mm-hmm.
and enlightening in terms of when we navigate topics or issues of identity in the D&I space, it really gave me a whole different mindset or comprehension or a new lens to consider. That is what I mean by
Mm-hmm.
enlightening. When I think
Yeah.
about healing, so that's probably more enlightening, is more to do with both my connection in terms of a
Okay.
personal background to what we do in the
Mm-hmm.
professional world and what we do in our
Okay.
practice, the D&I would say the healing element is way more of the personal in terms of I know what this looks like and what this would cost someone from
Mm-hmm.
my background and some with my family to be
Mm-hmm.
able to have done what we did in in introducing us as
Mm,
couple in the room. And we just wanted to love everybody that we met. We just wanted to bless everybody that we met. And that was really what we came to do. And it was a privilege to be able to do that in this lifetime. And for them to see,
yeah.
like, actually, this could be different. I know that on many levels. And I don't think I've got the correct language to even break down in the intricacies of what
Yeah.
levels that healing was taking place. But for me personally, that's what I feel that meant through that trip. So two, but if
Mm.
depending on which way you
Two.
wanted to look at it.
Yeah, no, no, definitely. And I think, just even hearing you speak about the trip within this conversation and even outside in our own personal chats, that definitely rings through. So thank you for sharing and thank you for being so honest and transparent and telling the audience about your story, because we love to bring people in and we love to be nosy and hear other people's experiences, their narratives, their stories. But it's always great to share as well, like what does our story, or what is our story,
Mm, mm,
you
mm.
know so I think it was just great to hear how you navigated this space of reflection upon your trip back home. And I think we both are in the camp of, after being away from our home countries, our home, our birthplaces, it's a whole nother level of, in the way we see the world and in the way we interact with people, even here in the UK. It's just a different level of experience that I'm sure we both have encountered, that would allow us to grow and um, to sympathize and empathize with a larger group of communities and different aspects of life, really. So thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, I'm excited for you to go back home in the future and see how that has developed and built upon what you've
For sure.
experienced now.
Yeah.
But I think for now it was just great for you to take this time as well to really reflect and digest what you have experienced and what does that mean for you, but also what does that mean for you and your husband as well, as a collective. So it was really great. And for our audience, we look forward to speaking with you once again. We have some exciting discussions in the pipeline that we are ready to get delve into. But just keep an eye out for that, because I'm really excited about a few of those that are upcoming. So thank you, take care, and have a blessed day wherever you are.